Hello and welcome to the Legacy Crusaders YouTube channel. My name is Benji and today we'll be looking at Tearalaments. We'll be looking at some tips for what to do with you when you play the deck or when you play against the deck. Either way, we'll cover a couple of tips. Our first tip is going to involve the Tearalaments main deck monsters. They all have an effect that says when this card is sent to the graveyard by a card effect. What exactly does it say? If this card is sent to the graveyard by a card effect, you can fusion summon one fusion monster from your extra deck by placing fusion materials mentioned on it from your hand, field, and or graveyard on the bottom of your deck in any order, including this card in your graveyard. You can only use this effect of this particular Tearalaments monster once per turn, which means if you were to decrow this monster, because this monster would no longer be in the graveyard, it would no longer be valid to perform the fusion summon. So all of the Tearalaments main deck monsters that have the effect to fusion summon, which is 3 out of 4 of them, all of them except Reno Heart have this effect. If you were to decrow it, it would resolve without effect. It will also use its 1 activation per turn because they're all hard once per turns. All right. You could also prevent them from resolving using something like Skullmeister or Ghost Bell and Haunted Mansion, but both of those have the opportunity to miss timing because a lot of these cards will activate off of the sequence of random mills, and you can only activate Ghost Bell or Skullmeister in response to the last thing on the chain, so there's always a chance that you'll miss the opportunity to activate them, so DD Crow is probably a safer bet. Called by the Grave would also work, but of course if it is your opponent's first turn and they're playing Tearalaments, you will not be able to use Called by the Grave on their first turn because it is a quick play spell. Next, you could also banish the fusion material they are likely using for the fusion monster that they are trying to summon, because the monster is not determined until the effect resolves. If you were to banish, for instance, their SHADDOLL SQUAMATA from their graveyard, there's a chance that they might not be able to perform the fusion summon of the monster they intended to summon. If they were trying to summon a window, you might force them to be put in a spot where they have to summon their Kakados. I apologize, my image doesn't have the correct name yet, but there is a chance that they'll be forced to summon a monster that they do not wish to summon. If they have the fusion materials around to legally summon a different monster, they are required to do. The effect must be resolved completely and totally. So DD crowing the particular monster can affect your opponent in odd ways. Another card a lot of people are playing is King of the Swamp. This is also an excellent target for the DD Crow, by the way, because there's a couple of weird monsters you get to go into using King of the Swamp, and we'll address those in a moment. King of the Swamp has 2 effects. First is you can send it from your hand to the graveyard to add a polymerization from your deck to your hand, which means you'll be able to fusion summon something like Guardian Chimera, whose effect is only able to be used should you fusion summon it using the effect of a spell card. And because the Tearalaments effects in the graveyard are not the effects of a spell card, if you summoned a Guardian Chimera using cards from your field and your hand, you would not be able to destroy or draw cards using its effect. Now, the second effect of the King of the Swamp is that it can be used as the fusion material of a named monster on a fusion monster. So if you wanted to summon Millennium Eyes Restrict, it would take the place of Relinquished, which is one of the 2 fusion materials for Millennium Eyes Restrict, as well as an effect monster, which can be the Tearalaments monster that's trying to shuffle itself back. So if you're playing the deck yourself, King of the Swamp is an excellent card to play because it gives you access to some fusions you wouldn't normally be able to play in the deck, because this will count as the named monster. You don't have to play a Relinquished, which is a ritual monster that doesn't do anything. You don't really want to play that. King of the Swamps would be an excellent substitute. Additionally, it can count as Alistair the Invoker when summoning Invoked CALIGA, because the fusion summoning Tearalaments monsters in the main deck are dark monsters. So you can use them as the dark monster for CALIGA, and King of the Swamps can be your Alistair the Invoker. Next, you could also search Fusion Substitute off of King of the Swamp because it is always treated as polymerization. If you play a Fusion Substitute, you cannot play 3 polymerizations. In combination, you can only play 3 of all of those cards that count as the same name at all times. And the reason we would play this card is it lets you combo with the field spell, Paralino the Parallel Primal Realm, and it's because if one of your Tearalaments cards is shuffled back into your extra deck or your main deck, or returned to your extra deck or main deck, it doesn't have to be shuffled in, you can target a card in the field and destroy it, which is a way to out a Mystic Mine using a spell effect. Although you could just play like Galaxy Cyclone and try and mill it off of your Tearalaments monsters. You can play Foolish Burial of Goods and either send Fusion Substitute or Galaxy Cyclone to the graveyard to out a Floodgate. You could also send the Tearalaments spells and trap cards to the graveyard. They generally have effects that activate when they're sent to the graveyard. Say, for instance, has the ability to add a Tearalaments monster from your deck to your hand. In addition to being an imperm, you can also send Meta Noise, which is a Book of Moon, which you can also use to add one of your Tearalaments from your graveyard to your hand. So there's some use with Foolish Burial of Goods in the deck. Could be a cool tech option. Next, there are some ways to activate your Tearalaments using artifacts besides their own. So you can use Time Thief Redoer. You can make Redoer using a Reno Heart or a Shaylin, both of which are level 4, so you can make Time Thief Redoer with them. Redoer detaches for effect, so if you use Redoer and detach one monster, you can't detach multiple monsters for the effect of Redoer. When it banishes itself, the additional monsters fall off, but they are not sent to the graveyard by effect. If you detach one of those monsters from Redoer for effect, it will trigger their effect, allowing you to fusion summon on your opponent's turn. Now, those are the only 2 level 4 ones, so that's all you can really make the Redoer with, but it is neat that you can trigger the fusions on your opponent's turn using these card effects. You can also trigger them with dangers, but that would only be on your turn. Dangers are card effects when they discard a card, so it would be another way to trigger them, but they're also dark monsters, making it easier to access things like Dracostapelia. Right? Branded Fusion would be a card that can send your Tearalaments from the deck to the graveyard, at least 3 out of 4 of them, to summon Lubellion using which would allow you to fusion summon immediately and give you access to the Albaz engine and a Mirror Jade. You could also use Branded Opening, which is a quick play spell, which means you can discard a Tearalament from your hand to summon an Alibur to search your Branded Fusion while triggering the effect of the Tearalaments that you discard, because the discard for Branded Opening is by effect, not as cost. So it's nice to know that there are cards that can trigger your Tearalaments on your opponent's turn, or just in interesting ways while giving you access to different engines. And the last thing I want to talk about is Dracostapelia, which is a very commonly summoned fusion monster in the Tearalaments deck. It uses any fusion monster and a dark monster, and all of the Tearalaments would be the dark monsters. So if you can get a fusion monster to your graveyard or your field, you can summon Dracostapelia pretty easily, although if you weren't aware, Kaleido Heart actually cannot be used as fusion material for the fusion summon of another monster. So if you have Kaleido Heart in the graveyard, you actually can't use Kaleido Heart to summon a Dracostapelia. So keep that in mind, that if your opponent is trying to use it, that they can't, and don't try to use it yourself. Now, Dracostapelia is very easy to summon in this deck just because of how generic its materials are for what you do, and you get fusion materials out very easily. But the effect of Dracostapelia is pretty good against Sprite because you can target their level 2 monsters, turning it into level 1 monsters by putting a Protoplant counter on them, and then they do not meet the condition for the effect monsters in the hand to summon themselves, but they could always just put another level 2 out and summon them. A different problem that you might run into is if you're trying to put a Protoplant counter on a monster that tributes itself as cost for its effect, or if your opponent were to use something like Forbidden Droplet to remove itself from the field. It'll be unaffected by Dracostapelia's continuous effect, which negates the effects of monsters with Protoplant counters on it, because the monster that leaves the field does not have counters on it. So if you had Skystriker Ace Ray and you put a counter on it and they tribute it for cost, it'll lose the counter immediately because it's not in the field, and it will resolve its effect without any problems. And that's going to wrap up the 5 tips I had regarding Tearalaments. If you have any questions or comments or your own tips, leave them in the comments below. If you want to do a how to play Tearalaments video and you're willing to help me, leave a comment, let me know, and we will do how to play Sprite as well soon.